Council, please come to order. Good morning. We are ready to resume with public comment on agenda item C1. First up to testify will be John Govan, then Brent Payne, and then John Warrenchuk. Good morning, Mr. Govan.
Good morning, Chairman Kaneen and members of the council. John Govan, Alaska Seafood Cooperative. Apologize for my.
Mr. Govan, if you can hold up. Members of the public, if you wish to carry on with your conversations, please take them to the hallway.
Thank you. John Govan, Alaska Seafood Cooperative. Apologize for my hoarse voice. I submitted some written comments. I hope you had a chance to look at them. They're aimed at the perspective that the Amendment 80 sector is not directly in this action, but it's nonetheless concerned about the methods and analyses and conclusions in the C1 document and the lack of SSC review for this emergency rule petition. And we feel that these purported benefits really need to be given careful review. So I guess I would say that the comments I have are more aimed at the SSC, but we don't have that process here. So I'll try to cover a few of them in the time I have available, but I think they're important to assessing whether the purported benefits of this action are actually going to be realized. So the first point, the analysis shows a figure 4.32 that shows the benthic invertebrates looking at sponges and says that the area is key habitat for sponges and has an abundance of sponges. So I was surprised by that because I know that the sponge species that are habitat structure are calcareous and homocleromorph sponges, and they don't grow on sand bottom and high natural disturbance areas. So I looked at that figure and I looked at the citation, which was Layman 2021, and that is not listed as a reference in the references. So I looked at, maybe it's a typo, I looked at 2022 Layman paper and I didn't find these data there. So I'm not saying that this is data is not legitimate. I'm just saying that I think we need to review this. I looked at the deep sea coral programs website portal for sponges and corals. It's in NOAA's deep sea coral research and technology program. And I presented that figure and it does not show the sponges in this shallow habitat in the red king crab savings area. So I think we need to review that because a lot of the underpinnings of the purported habitat effects are reduced impacts on sponges. I guess the area I'd like to focus on is the characterization about the relative importance of the red king crab savings area. And this you discussed yesterday with the analysts. The paper reviews different sets of data and admits that there's limitations to using the summer trawl survey. The directed fishery occurs in mainly October. And what we don't really have good data on is the winter distribution. There's tagging data and there isn't a lot of discussion of kind of the limitations of that, but I feel there really need the SSC to look at that tagging data. This is the second time it's been used in an analysis without any SSC review. And I think opportunistic tagging data has a lot of potential for being affected by when and how long the tags are out and where they were released. So I think that's important. I firmly believe that we don't have good information about the winter distribution of red king crab. That's why I've been pushing for a winter survey of some sort to give us this information. I believe that the assumed benefits to red king crab of adding gears to this current restriction in the red king crab savings area has an equal probability of shifting effort to areas where crab encounters are higher as they are lower. And so I don't think the purported benefits are well demonstrated in this analysis. I think in your discussion with Dr. Cates, the sort of endpoint was, we know that there's year-round presence of red king crab in that area and that it's designated as an important area to crab. That was designated 30 years ago, and the Bering Sea ecosystem has changed dramatically. I think if that's the standard, that there's year-round presence, then you could say the same for zone 1. You could say the same for the whole area T. So I caution you in assuming these benefits are there. And also that you need to weigh the effects of where that effort's going to shift to on the potential that it could encounter more or the same amount of crab or less, we don't know. And then the other bycatch trade-offs, which are well described in the paper, I think. So I'll leave it at that. And if you want to ask me about the other points, don't have enough time to cover them. I appreciate your attention this morning on Friday. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gavin. Are there any questions? Ms. Kimball.
Thank you for your testimony. You mentioned the winter survey, and it seems like an opportune time to ask where, the status of that survey or any additional information you could say about either the funding or the timing for that potential.
Thanks for the question, Ms. Kimball, through the chair. I haven't had any recent conversations with Scott Goodman and the Bering Sea Fisheries Research Foundation. I did have a conversation with Chris Sid in the state of Alaska. And I think he shares the view that I have of the need for this, and I think is exploring survey ideas with potentially using a pot survey and getting some funding through the state. That's the last I've heard. But as for the other efforts I described last time, I don't have anything to update that suggests there's any progress in that direction.
Ms. Drobnica.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Gavin, for your testimony. I think that your letter did reference some of the section regarding the pot interactions as well. And I know there's some conversation regarding that yesterday. Wondering if you could expand on your thoughts on the value of building upon that in the future, and incorporating that into some of the information that we already have with our EFH process and fishing effects model.
Yep, thanks for the question, Ms. Drobnica, and through the chair. I learned from the discussion yesterday with the staff about some of the questions you asked. So what I wrote in my letter, I'm kind of updating a little bit. My view of it was that it's meaningless to compare the catch rate of pots with non-pelagic trawl and pelagic trawl, given the difference in the width of the gear and the difference in probability of retaining the pot, and also that the two gears can fish different areas. I think the response by staff was, well, it was new information and it sort of characterized the potential of effects of the gear or how the gear was fished. And I guess I don't see that myself. I don't know how pots are caught in pelagic gear. I know that in non-pelagic gear, when we get a pot in the net, it tends to actually make the foot rope fish harder on bottom, and we scoop up a lot of benthic invertebrates because it's caught in the front of the net, and the foot rope doesn't perform the same way. So you kind of drag in, and the captains are, through experience, know that something's going wrong with the gear. You see a little bit of loss of the gear spread. So I don't know what this information tells you. I think the EFH model is your best source of information for the amount of bottom contact. And I don't think that the catch rate for pots is useful to characterize how the benthic habitat is affected, because I don't know if it's because of catching the pot or all that. I think you'd have to study this to be able to understand it as an index. So I hope that answers your question, but I'm not persuaded that information added much scientific back basis for making the judgments that are discussed in the paper.
Any further questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up is Brent Payne.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the council. My name is Brent Payne. I'm the Executive Director of United Catcher Boats. So UCB represents the owners of 71 catcher vessels that fish primarily for pollock in the Eastern Bering Sea. Very much appreciate the council or the agency's decision to allow the council to weigh in on this issue before the Secretary of Commerce makes a decision on this emergency rule. Realize that the emergency rule is submitted to the Commerce Department and it wasn't submitted to you, but through the meeting in October, you got the opportunity to provide this. I guess we have very detailed comments presented to you in a letter here, and I don't have time to go through them, but I asked you to read through them. We make the argument that this doesn't meet the 4 criteria to establish this action by an emergency rule. It falls short of all 4 categories. I won't go into that because I just want to talk about a few things that came to mind after listening to the presentation by agency staff yesterday and the analysts. I think with haste makes waste is my kind of thing in my brain here. And I think this was a rush job because of the Thanksgiving holiday and the timing of the October meeting and the timing of this meeting. You've got a document, I think that would be much more robust and better to present to you if it had some peer review, interagency review, council staff review, or SSC review. There's a lot of opinions in this document. There's a lot of statements that are unsubstantiated by scientific research. And I think it would be a better document if you had the time to do that kind of internal review. So, and what do I mean by that? Well, there's a lot of information in this document that talks about the value of the red crab savings area and the creation of it. I actually was on the council staff and the crab plant team meeting in the early 1990s, and I was involved in that issue. And I remember very clearly the reasons for that. It's interesting that the Essential Fish Habitat Magnuson Act action happened many years after the establishment of the red crab savings area. So you didn't have the EFH regulations on the books when you created the savings area. The savings area was created because of numbers of crab taken by the bottom trawl fleet, not because of protection of habitat. Protection of habitat came much later when the EFH regulations went into the books. So the red crab savings area went into place in 1993, 1994. EFH went into regulations, a decade later. So you got to think about that. You can't say that this is protecting sponge and habitat for crab, but you got to really look back at the record of why the crab savings area was created in the first place before you can make those statements. The second thing I want to talk about is the impacts and then the statements in this document about the impacts of the bottom benthic habitat by pelagic gear being in contact with the bottom. We worked very closely with Dr. Craig Rose when the EFH impact analysis model was first created. I remember Donna Parker and John Gruber and I created a survey to ask every single captain of the Bering Sea catcher vessel fleet what they thought how much time that their net was on the bottom. And Dr. Craig Rose, in his analysis to the council, was peer reviewed by the SSC and peer reviewed by the internal NIMS Alaska Fisheries Science Center folks, and Craig Rose's team said at that time 20 to 50%. Sam Cunningham reported that to you in the last 2 discussion papers on this issue, and that was presented to you. It seems like the analysis from here takes a little twist on that and says there's a lot more impact to the bottom than what Dr. Craig Rose reported. So that really needs to be ground truthed, I think. Secondly, there's 2 bits of research I think that really need to happen here to really give you an informed decision here. Best available information is number 1, what is the actual unobserved crab mortality? In our letter, we show you that we catch about 11% of our pollock in the last couple of years inside the crab savings area. That's roughly about 20, let me just get it here. That last year we caught 24,000 tons of pollock inside the savings area for the inshore sector out of 230,000 tons of pollock. for our whole inshore sector. The number of crab taken last year was 4 inside, that was including the whole area inside the savings area and outside the savings area. The observer program reported that we caught 6 in 2021. So, and 2 in 20 and 3 in 2019. So the observer program, so is there crab being caught and it's unreported? That's not being brought up in the cod end. I think there needs to be research on that to really understand it. And so the other thing I think that needs to be further researched through the EFH updates is what is the actual impact to the bottom by pelagic gear coming in contact with the bottom. The jury's outstanding. I don't think you can make statements that say there is actual impact there without having that kind of research. Sam Cunningham reported in the last 2 discussion papers, the research that was done by Newfoundland and the Norwegians on the impact of crab with the Canadian and the Norwegian bottom trawl industry. Craig Rose actually with some work with his staff looked at what the impacts were by bottom trawl gear on the bottom he tried to put additional retaining type nets underneath the net. And there's never been any applied research with a pelagic gear. And I think that needs to happen before you can kind of make an informed decision here. We realize that this is a crisis here. The UCB members hold over 11% of the red Cape
Mr.
crab
Payne,
quota.
your time is up. Can you provide a summary
Sure.
comment?
Please make an informed decision. My members do hold 11% of the crab quota in the Eastern Bering Sea red crab fishery. It's an issue near and dear to our hearts. We are also losing money too because we can't fish in that fishery. But don't rush into doing something here. We catch, the data indicates that we catch more crab outside the
Mr. Payne,
savings area. So
let's-
I'm sorry.
Let's see if there's any
I'm done.
questions. Okay, thanks. Council members, any questions for Mr. Payne? Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Mr. Payne, for your testimony. And since you're the first person representing the Pollock fishery, I'll ask you the question that maybe we discussed a little bit earlier. What do you think the inclusion of the information in the emergency rule analysis about capture of pot gear by pelagic trawl gear provides the council, what does that tell us in your opinion, and how should we consider that information for this action?
Yeah, through the chair, I think Mr. Govan, I would align my comments with Mr. Govan's comments, but I'll also say that, I saw that information, and I think the information that was presented to you shows that roughly 1 in 10 tows is coming in contact with a crab pot. I asked a couple captains after I saw that if that's what they're experiencing, and that I think that's an inaccurate ratio. We the Bering Sea catch a vessel fleet is there 70 active vessels. Each vessel for the A season is making 14, 15 trips, 20 trips for the B season, 3 tows per trip. If you do the math, that would indicate at a ratio of 1 tow to 10, we're catching a crab pot. That would be thousands of crab pots we would be bringing in. And I just don't, it doesn't add up to me. And the captains don't see that amount of encounter rates with crab pots. So I think that would need to be further investigated in terms of the amount of crab pots taken by the Pollock fleet. Secondly, I think you need to look at the area where those crab pots are taken and also the shape of those crab pots. What I was led to believe by talking to captains is usually the crab pots they come encounter with are the ones that are the buoy and lines are cut off by the ice in the Opelio fishery, and they're derelict pots. But I guess the pictures I saw in this paper show, very old pots that have been out there for a number of years. They had sea anemones and growth on them. And the rebar was quite rusted and actually broken a little bit. So we have come in contact with pots. I guess I would just say that after APA presented information with their research with Dr. Harris in his FAST lab, UCB met with Dr. Harris, and we're in the process of signing a contract to do what APA member companies are doing with his research on the impacts of how pelagic trawl gear is actually fished on the bottom in the Bering Sea, and what working and modeling that, and then actually doing some applied research to actually see what is actually going on with the benthic habitat with the pelagic trawl net. And I think that's the kind of research you need to have done to truly understand what's going on, rather than saying these nets are coming in contact with a few crab pots, and that cause and effect. You're on the bottom because you're catching a crab pot. I think you have a better tool that can provide you information of what the actual impacts are to the benthic habitat, crab habitat, if you do a more further robust research project.
Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. My second question, and I don't think you covered this in your testimony, but I just wondered, in terms of the emergency rule analysis of the potential impacts of the red king crab savings area closure on Chinook and non-Chinook salmon PSC, understanding it was an analysis in a compressed timeframe, in terms of the conclusions of that analysis, that I think it was characterized there wouldn't be maybe significant increases in salmon PSC, but potentially some. And so can you help me a little bit with the assumptions that had to be made about where the fleet might move and the impacts on both Chinook and non-Chinook salmon PSC?
Thank you, through the chair. I'm sorry I went over on my time. I'll try not to do that. Yes, in our letter, we go into that, we make that point, Ms. Baker, that we've worked closely with the state staff to try and get an estimate of what the impacts on Chinook and herring will be if we are moved out of the savings area. Like I said, about 11% of our pollock was caught in that area last year and the year before. It's a very clean area relative to Chinook and herring. So you're going to displace that 20,000 tons of fish. We can catch it elsewhere, but what's going to happen is you're going to have an increased rate of Chinook. And if we do trigger a herring savings area, it exacerbates the situation even worse, because we have the sea land conservation area that's closed. We will have the savings area for herring closed. And so, and then we would have the red crab savings area closed. So the captains are going to be a little bit hard pressed to figure out where they can fish, and using the sea state information with our rolling hotspot closure program, Chinook salmon will be a more pressing concern to manage for. I can't give you an and Ms. Mattson, I think, was trying to give you a number or an estimated number. I can't give you a number of what that increase would be. All I can tell you right now is it will be higher than what it has been with that area open, both for herring and both for Chinook. And lastly, we did take a look at our crab encounter rates, and we think that it's a 3-to-1 ratio. If we are displaced out of the savings area, even though we catch less than 10 crab a year, we're going to increase our encounter rate by 2/3 on red crab outside the area, because of what John Govan said. We don't know where those crab reside, and we don't have the information to be able to move the fleet away from areas of high crab concentration.
Mr. Mesereau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. I hate to put you on the spot like this, but because we've taken the testimony out of order, I'm not sure if we have any more Pollock representatives coming up. And so I want to ask you this question and just get your feedback on it. In the analysis on page 65, the author makes the statement that an observer is not always on deck during gear retrieval, thus some crab may not always be counted. And what I'm wondering is, I know there's 200% observer coverage on the CPs, but on the catcher boats, how often do you haul back gear without an observer present? And what safeguards are in place to prevent that is not a regular occurrence where crab aren't counted?
Thank you, through the chair. And I didn't read that paragraph in the document. I was, got it after Thanksgiving. I was rushing through it, but I would question that statement. And your action on the electronic monitoring of cameras, cameras don't sleep in the bunk, and I can't, it's hard to get them out of bed because the cameras are always on, right? So if a haulback occurs say early in the morning, 4 or 5 in the morning or something like that, and the observer's in the bunk sleeping, there's protocols. You can't go you can't go shake them and say, please come out on the back deck. You got to carefully put an alarm on and say, please watch this haul back. For the most part, most of the fleet now has camera systems. We have over 50 vessels that have the camera systems on board. So 24 hours of video monitoring surveillance is occurring on the back deck of a boat. So those camera systems are on. So they are monitoring and observing that the Pacific States Fisheries Commission staff that does the data review can look back at 100% of the haulbacks of the fleet and say whether or not they can see a crab coming overboard the gantry, the stern of the boat. So that's pretty good. But I can't give you an exact example, a percentage of how many hauls are not observed because an observer is in the cabin and not on the back deck of the boat. But I think it's a pretty rare occurrence. So on a typical pollock trip, boat steams out of Dutch or Accutane, it sets the net, they haul back 3 times, fills the boat, comes back. So that haul back time period, three tows, half hour, an hour per haul back period of time when the fish is being dumped. I would think it's a rare occurrence that an observer is on the back deck, not on the back deck of a boat, but I can follow up if you'd like and give more detail.
That's sufficient. Just gives us a flavor for how much weight to give that statement based on your comments. I appreciate it.
And thank you, Mr. Mesro. Any further questions for Mr. Payne?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right, next up is John Warrenchuk. Following Mr. Warrenchuk will be Chris Tran and Lauren Devine, and then Mateo Pasadon. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. Well, thank you. And for the record, my name is John Warrenchuk, Senior Scientist and Campaign Manager for Oceana. Does it sound weird? Good to be here in person. This is always helpful to see people's faces. Well, thanks for taking testimony today on the red king crab emergency rule or emergency petition. We appreciated the council asking for an analysis around this, and we appreciated the staff's quick delivery around the analysis. We submitted a letter on this. We also submitted a letter to the Federal Register in support of this action. And I just submitted some visuals to follow along with our letter here. So in this picture here, this is probably a 2 to 3 year old red king crab. It's right on the cusp of switching from, you see it, this is probably from a survey amongst a bunch of invertebrates that at this age it would use to hide or hide from predators. This is part of its habitat, these benthic invertebrates that form its habitat. We see mussels, we see looks like sea raspberries, which are soft corals, a bunch of other species. And just as they grow out of this size, they would start to rely on all these invertebrates more as prey. So they feed on sponges, corals, invertebrates, any kind of benthic thing. So what you're looking at when you're minimizing the impact of trawling on all these species is both protecting its habitat and its prey. Next slide, please. And it's reasonable to focus on trawling as the biggest source of impact to both of these species' habitat. We've already learned from the EFH analysis that trawling, both pelagic and non-pelagic, is the biggest source of fishery habitat disturbance. Cumulative impact today of over 165,000 square miles. That's 97% of all the fisheries footprint. Next slide, please. And what we're looking at is protecting what we call, the breadbasket of the Bering Sea. These are all these invertebrates that make up the biodiversity and the habitat complexity in a place where there isn't a lot of habitat complexity. So these animals take a while to grow, and you've heard me testify here at the council with some disagreement on what the recovery rates are. But nonetheless, these things like sea peaches, sea onions, these are types of tunicates, corals, sponges. They form the structure, they form the prey base for all these animals that live on the seafloor. Next slide, please. And this is the kind of habitat you would see in this area. So we know that in the red king crab savings area and in much of the middle domain of the Bering Sea, hard substrate is pretty rare. But where these animals grow and attach is to any sort of anything hard that's on the bottom. So a rock that's been dropped there from past glacial activity way back in the Ice Age, or hard things like snail shells. And so this lovely blob, which would look a lot nicer in the water with all its polyps and everything out, has soft corals, Jersemia corals. Those are sea raspberries. It looks like it might have some snail eggs. Looks like it has some barnacles. But the point of showing this is that there has been studies. NIMS has spent millions of dollars looking at this stuff, that cumulative trawling in the Bering Sea causes a change in the community structure of the seafloor. The animals, any sort of bottom dwelling animal, will be smaller than average in a trawled area versus an untrawled area. And there'll be less epibenthic stuff that sticks up from the bottom. And these small changes can mean big impacts. So if you could imagine, if the average size of the snail was smaller, the average size of their shell would be smaller. When it loses its shell or dies, the stuff starts growing on it. But if the snail doesn't live to be a large snail, there's not enough room on its shell for this other stuff to grow. So you can see how these subtle changes could have cascading consequences. Next slide, please. So here's the red king crab savings area in red, and all the orange blobs are the 30-year average abundance of red king crab. You can see it's a very important habitat, both inside and outside the area. Next slide, please. And here's an example of habitat impacts from the fishing effects model. This is just the loss of habitat over 25%. And you can see lots of edge effects around the king crab savings area. Now, next slide, please. But if you start looking at the effect of the individual habitat features, not the average impact of everything that takes the time it takes to recover, you start to see larger impacts. So for example, here's the loss of something, for example, sea onions that might take 2 years to grow. You can see big splotches of area where there's over 25% loss of this prey and habitat for crab. Next slide, please. Now, the effects get even bigger if you assume some of these structures take 5 years to grow, which also the fisheries effects model did. So this is the effect on just a single habitat feature, for example, sponge. In reference back to Mr. Govin's testimony, all this area in orange and darker brown, there is sponges there. There are sponges there from the trawl survey. There's sponges there in the bycatch. So I'm not clear why there's some disagreement whether or not sponges occur in this area, because they sure come up in the nets a lot. But the importance of showing this, and we actually had to FOIA for this information just to show.
Mr. Warrenchuck, your time is up. Can you provide a summary?
Sure. The point of showing this is that you are in the habitat management business, and this what you want to avoid is habitat fragmentation or big swaths of empty habitat. So if a crab or any other species relied on some benthic invertebrate that took 5 years to grow,
Mr. Warrenchuck,
you would find a hard time finding it in any of
Let's-
this area.
let's see if there's any questions from
We'll close
council.
there. Thank you. Boy, 6 minutes goes fast, doesn't it?
Are there any questions for Mr. Warrenchuck? Okay, Mr. Witherall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just trying to figure out what the takeaway is from this map on fishing effects on habitat. I guess what I'm not seeing is the effects of the pelagic trawl fisheries on habitat inside the red king crab savings area, which is what this action is. So I guess I'm trying to figure out what the point you were trying to make with these maps.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Witherall. So this map is the effect of all the fishing gears on a habitat feature that would take up to 5 years to grow or recover. And the point of showing it here is in that southern portion of the red king crab savings area. That's the both pelagic and non-pelagic impact. This is the area that can be open to non-pelagic gear when the red king crab fishery is open, but it's also the area that the pelagic gear can operate in year round. And the point of showing this is that you have an area here which was intended at some point to conserve crab habitat, and in a significant proportion of it, you've lost 25% or more of sponges or any kind of longer living invertebrate. So that the blob there in the southern part it has some trawl impacts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm still not getting it because it looks like in the previous figure that trawling doesn't appear to have any impact on the habitat within the king crab savings area. So maybe you can tell me later in the hallway. I'm not quite sure I
Sure.
understand.
Well, we could go back one slide there. So this was 5 years. This is 2 years. So the way that model works, and there may be impacts that are less than 25% as well. I just cut it off at 25% for the visual. So it either might be the trawling wasn't occurring often enough to go over that 25% threshold, but there's still impacts in there. They might be 19% or 10% or something. So that's my fault for my graphical visualization.
Mr. Misro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Warrencheck. My question was just to give you a chance to maybe help me understand a little bit more. You put a slide up there, which we don't have to go back to, that had a picture of a small shell with a bunch of invertebrates living on it. And we know that a pelagic trawl has mesh that is huge at the opening of the net. And for many meetings now, the crabbers have speculated that crabs could be caught up in the net and then fall through those large meshes at the belly of the net where the foot rope is. So if that's the case, then, and you're talking about habitat that's small shells that's critical to benthic invertebrates, how does that play out? It doesn't seem like pelagic trawling, well, it may have an effect on crab, particularly mating and molting crab. How does it have any impact on small shell distribution and other habitat that those kind of things can live on? I would think it would scoop them up and they would fall out the big mesh and land right back behind where they got scooped up, just like it's speculated that crab, which are much larger, do. So I'm just wondering, how does that connect to the story that you were telling for us?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Mesro, for the question. It is true that it seems that a much smaller proportion ends up in the net itself for observers to estimate and count. But all these species do end up in the nets for observer sampling. So it's not the best indicator of the overall impact. But what is a relatively useful indicator, which you've been using for a while, is the fishing effects model, which just makes some estimates of what happens to these invertebrates when it interacts with the trawl net. And then I referenced the longer term studies that Bob McConaughey, he actually did up in that upper left corner there, trawls in that orange area, and then trawls on the other side of that red king crab savings area boundary. And then they ran a video transect, and they created a photo mosaic that's like 1 kilometer long, counting every single species in there. And what they find is that in areas that were lots of trawling, the animals might not end up in the net, but they get turned over, they might get crushed. The rock or the shell they grew on might get buried. And there's just a cumulative impact to all those kind of creatures. And so on average, they were smaller, less abundant. And these were the indicators that that particular paper concluded. But that stuff has not risen up into the management process to influence any sort of decisions yet.
Okay, thanks for that. It's helpful. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Misro. Ms. Kimball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Warrencheck. I just want to clarify, our sole task under this agenda item is to identify whether this proposed action meets 3 emergency rule criteria. And so if I'm out of bounds because you didn't testify to the criteria at all, please tell me. But is this information, which seems really appropriate under our EFH items, to contextualize the analysis that was provided that didn't provide information on the fishing effects model? I'm trying to relate this directly to our task, which is around the 3 criteria.
Right. Thank you, Ms. Kimball, for the question. I didn't spend a lot of time analyzing the criteria. But yes, I'm presenting this for context. I was excited because I got this data from the Freedom of Information Act request. We were to get the data because we've been interested in this for a while to see the effect on individual habitat features. And we're just trying to connect the dots between what a crab does in its life history and what kind of habitat it prefers or needs and how it interacts with that, and how that habitat can change when there's fishing impacts. So it's for context. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kimball. Further questions for Mr. Warrencheck? Thank you. Next up is Chris Tran and Lauren Devine. Good morning.
Good morning, Chairman and council members. For the record, my name is Chris Tran. I am with Dr. Lauren Devine, and we represent the Aleut community of St. Paul Island. First, I want to thank council staff for providing the thorough analysis for the Red King Crab Savings Area. I want to echo previous testifiers and stress of the fact that the Bristol Bay Red King Crab are in a dire situation, and they are stock of serious concern. As you've heard in the presentation, and as best available science has clearly shown, the Red King Crab Savings Area is an important habitat area for the Red King Crab year-round. The area provides refuge for crab during the most vulnerable stages in life history, and including molting and mating. It cannot be understated how important habitat is for the species and how damage for this habitat can jeopardize the future of the species. According to the council's own discussion paper from February 2022, the vast majority of C4 habitat disturbance in the North Pacific is caused by trawls. Prevention of potential trawl disturbance is a responsible and common sense solution to allow habitats recovery. The Red King Crab Savings Area is not meeting its original intent of providing undisturbed habitat for crab due to trawling, both pelagic and non-pelagic, that is causing impact to the critical C4 habitat in the savings area and resulting in the loss of essential fish habitat. As the analysis has shown, these gear types demonstrate on the C4 up to 40 to 100% of the time they are deployed. As a community situated in the middle of once productive fisheries that are experiencing devastating declines, including snow at Red King Crab, as well as Pebble Island's Blue King Crab, which used to be abundant and now are incredibly scarce, we asked the council to use an ecosystem lens for deciding on this issue. For example, the council could evaluate the dynamic or adaptive closed area boundaries that shift periodically based on environmental triggers or scientific data. The council could evaluate the Pebble Islands Habitat Conservation Zone and aligning it with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game home plate area closure for savings, crab savings. Precautionary conservative management action will ensure ecosystem level benefits and ensure crab are not disturbed in their most vulnerable stages in life histories. We acknowledge that the action will not address climate change impacts on crabs at the individual and populations levels, but could provide much needed relief to animals that are already struggling to survive during the most vulnerable state. That concludes my portion. Lauren, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you. With the time that we have left, I just want to